start?
Yeah, I think we're good to go, Nuala.
Okay, great. Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. Before we kind of get into the meat of anything, I just want to say that we're planning to record this evening's discussion. So if you don't want to be a part of the recorded discussion, which will go up on the Newham Council website, at least for the duration of LGBT History Month and maybe beyond. So if you don't want to be part of that, then please switch off your cameras and also just change your name, your sign-in name just to one name so that you wouldn't be identifiable. If you see me, I'm just down there as Nuala. Um, we also have behind the scenes, we've got Dominique and Monica from Newham Council who are helping on the IT side, and we've got Priscilla from the Newham Community Cinema who's moderating and will be putting things in the chat and liaising with the questions and so on. So hello and welcome to the Newham LGBT plus History Month, presented by the Newham Community Cinema in partnership with WOF, which is the Women Over 50 Film Festival. We really hope that you enjoyed those two fantastic films there, She Is Juiced, Slice 4, Sarah Jane Moon, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I'm Nuala O'Sullivan and I'm from the Women Over 50 Film Festival. Some of you might know me from work I've done with Newham Community Cinema at Stratford Library, where we used to meet in person and play short films and feature films. So hello to new friends and old friends alike. I'm so glad that you've joined us this evening. I'm going to run through how the next 30 or 40 minutes is going to go, and then we'll crack on with our discussion with the fabulous painter from She Is Juiced, Sarah Jane Moon. She's our very own Slice 4. She's going to be with us tonight. So Sarah and I will start off with a few thoughts about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and then we'll go into a deeper discussion about Sarah's own work, her process. We'll find out the importance of who she paints and why, and if we've got time, find out a little bit about what life in the pandemic is like for an artist. And we'll talk too about what it's like to be the subject of a documentary, what it's like to have that camera in your face. We'd love to hear from you this evening, so please have a think about any comments you have about Portrait of a Lady, or any thoughts or questions you have for Sarah Jane. And put them in the chat and we'll come to them later in the session. We'll wrap up at the end of our time together with some useful links from Sarah so you know how to follow her work. We'll give you some info about what's coming up next Thursday and for the other Thursdays in the month and how you can find out about what else is happening in Newham Council's LGBT history event. I am absolutely delighted to introduce this evening's guest. It's Sarah Jane Moon. And Sarah is a painter who specialises in portraiture and figurative painting. Her work explores identity, sexuality, and gender presentation, as well as interrogating formal painterly concerns. She's exhibited with the National Portrait Gallery, and her portraiture has featured in Time magazine, The Guardian, Wallpaper, Studio International, and House and Gardens magazine. In 2020, Sarah exhibited in the BP Portrait Award exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, as well as at the Royal Society Portrait Painters annual exhibition, amongst many others. Welcome, Sarah. So let's kick off with Portrait of a Lady on Fire. What a film. I absolutely loved it. I loved the story, I loved the colours, I loved the main love relationship, and I loved the relationship with work, you know, just how important the creative process was to Marion. I loved that every woman's story in the film was important, from the kitchen maid to the countess and to those lovely lovers in between. I loved how the film was imagined and created by a queer French woman, Celine Chima. Um, and she says that the film began with her desire to break away from cinematic convention. She says, as a screenwriter, you're always being told a good scene is one where somebody wants something and the other one doesn't want to give it. But in the end, it's always about this same negotiation and power dynamic. And I really wanted to make a love story, even a story about friendship, without that old dynamic. So you have to take the man out of the frame. So I just think it's a really interesting and totally refreshing point of view that's reflected in this glorious film. Sarah, what did you make of it?
Thanks, Nuala. It's really nice to see you, and thank you so much, Anthony and Council, for having me tonight. I'm really thrilled to be chatting to you all, especially after such an amazing film. It's one of my favourites, and really, I loved it. Frankly, that's sort of all there is to it. Really, it's one of the films I think that really gets right so much about portraiture and what it is to make a painting, and over and above that, it's really ambitious in what it tries to do, I think, in that tackling of the female gaze and really trying to investigate and sort of kind of disrupt that traditional power dynamic of the subject and the object, you know, the painter and the person being painted. And there's this wonderful sort of friendship and love story, which in and of itself to me seems quite queer in a way. It's kind of, it's friendship and love and respect and admiration. And also the film is just an amazing, I think, portrait of a woman at work, you know, of Marianne. And I mean, there's so much I love about it. I could talk for a really long time about it. I know we don't have an awful lot of time this evening, but I think that for me stands out, that way that the director has really consciously tried to untangle that kind of power dynamic and subvert it. And I, in my own work, you know, attempt in some way to do that, because it is a loaded sort of thing to do, to paint someone. It's sort of, in a way, you're responsible for representing someone. And I'm always trying to find ways and to disrupt that, or to make it more collaborative in some sense. And I think that really comes across in the film, and that Eloise, you know, goes from being the sort of object or objectified, the person being painted, and she becomes more and more of a subject throughout the film, which I think is really interesting and really important.
There's that beautiful bit in the middle where she says, well, you know, you think that you're looking at me, but who do you think I'm looking at when you're looking at me? And it really captures actually, you know, the way that balance can shift and must be shifting all the time, actually. One of the things I think that's really striking is the female gaze. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about you know, what that means either in the film or in your own work. What does the female gaze mean to you?
Well, it's a big question, and one that I sort of grapple with really on a daily basis. You know, how do I represent people? You know, generally when I choose people to paint, quite often they're women, quite often they're queer women. I'm female and queer as well, so already that's a certain dynamic, I guess. Yeah, it's interesting, because to be a portrait painter, or even a painter full stop, is to work in a tradition that is predominantly male, you know, even though there are women artists that were working throughout history. It's much easier obviously to be a painter if you were a man, for various reasons. And so it is this tradition, and we have these kind of tropes of, you know, painting the nude, painting the female nude, and all of the power dynamics entailed there. So it's really complicated, and I mean, for me, I suppose, you know, I'm trying to add to the genre of painting. You know, I don't think the genre of portrait painting can be changed overnight, but I think I can in some way, you know, find, you know, take on that responsibility to add to it, to give my point of view. And I think all of art and culture is really about that. Really, it's about making space. It's about individuals giving their points of view, particularly when they come from minority communities. I think that's really important in terms of diversity on any number of levels, but just really trying to give a perspective that maybe has not always been the norm or the traditional perspective. You know, so many portraits in our history and in art history are from a particular perspective and of particular types of people. And I would like to sort of say, you know, there are other people out there, and people like me and people who come from my community who maybe aren't entirely like me, but we need to embrace that sort of diversity and to be visible. And the act of painting, I suppose, in a very literal sense, is the act of making visible. You don't necessarily need to write an essay about it, but
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I
really,
think what you're saying there about, it's traditionally and in a lot of history, it's been men painting men of power and prestige, which brings us really nicely onto the short that we saw about your work, because you mentioned that historically, your people at the margins aren't being shown so much. So it gives us a chance to talk about who you paint and why. I'd like to talk a little bit about the short that we showed, She Is Juice, Slice 4, Sarah Jane Moon by Lois Norman, which we played at WAF a couple of years ago. So I've got just a question about the short, and it's, how did the documentary come about? And how do you feel about being the subject of another artist putting the focus on you? What was that like? I mean, you mentioned a little bit in the short that you say you were kind of uncomfortable, but tell us a little bit about how the documentary came about and your relationship with the filmmaker.
I think I've seen it now. I think it was made in sort of 2015, so it feels to me like that was a long time ago in terms of my art practice and what I'm making now. But as much as when I see my face sort of zoomed in close up on a massive screen, as I have done at various film festivals, and you sort of, I think all of us kind of internally cringe and think, oh, why did I say that, or whatever. I mean, it's
Zoom is getting us all a wee bit more comfortable. Even I'm thinking, oh well, I can manage myself on the screen. Yeah, I know what you mean though.
Yeah, there is a sort of element just to seeing yourself take up so much space, which maybe I shouldn't be apologetic about, but anyway, I do think it's a really beautiful film, and I'll forever be grateful to Lois for having made it. As I've had it playing in the background of several of my sort of exhibitions, or playing as an addition to an exhibition. And it is, I love the interviews with various friends of mine talking about my work. I mean, that's really special, and it comes across to me when I watch it is kind of a love letter to my work. I do find it really, I love it. I'm really fond of the film. And with Lois, I totally trusted her and was very happy to kind of hand over to her without having too much sort of input in a way, because, I mean, I think you sort of have to do that when someone is working creatively. You need to give trust and some permission. And I think the best work always results when that happens, in my experience, when someone says sort of do what you like. I always feel more at ease and more comfortable to take risks or to be more expressive. And so I hope that that's what I did with Lois. In terms of how we met, it was briefly, I just remembered before this is Zoom actually, but we met in a pub of all places, which
Excellent.
is
to be back in a pub.
Yeah, it's one of the lovely things about London and the diversity in London and just the sheer amount of people. I was out with a friend after a book launch, and we were in Holborn or somewhere, and we had to share a table with other people as there wasn't any room. This is before COVID, obviously. And we shared a table with Lois, and she was there with someone else. And then my friend went up to the bar for a drink, and we sort of started making small talk, and we got chatting and became friends. And then sometime after that, she approached me for the series of films, of which there are 3 others of other artists.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, no, it's a really beautiful film, and as you say, it's all, you can see that it's about, because we get to see your sitters and how they trust you, and it's quite clear in how honest and open you are about the work that you do, but also being in front of the camera. You can see that you can see the relationship ebb and flow between the two of you, which is something I've heard the director of this film talk about. It's basically a team of women that made that film, and she talked about a circular view, and that the way that she looked at her DP, the director of photography, and the way that she looked at the actors and how the painter looked at the model, and she said it was just a really open circle, which is a really interesting way, I think, of talking about a working relationship, I thought. But it's the core of it was that there was a trust between the artists and the other people involved. I was wanting to talk a little bit, especially because it is LGBTQI History Month. I wanted to talk about queer representation in your work, because we saw in the short that that you do a lot of queer representation. So it's a very open question. How important is queer representation in your work? And if it's important, why is it important?
Yeah, I suppose in a word, I think it's really important. And I generally, when I have the choice, and I'm not being commissioned as such, or approached by people who want me to paint them, I will choose to paint people who I sort of admire and respect, and I think are doing interesting and important work in a way. So it's a really hard thing to pin down, but it's definitely a combination of factors. They might be writers or filmmakers or performers, all sorts of people, but there's something about what they're doing and their work that I really relate to or sort of want to kind of investigate through a portrait. But above and beyond that, I just think visibility and representation is so important in terms of being queer. And in the film, if you've watched it, you'll know that I came out relatively late in my late 20s. And I do wonder sometimes, who knows how these things work, but I wonder if it was because I just couldn't see what queer representation and visibility was about. And I'm from New Zealand, and sort of suburban New Zealand. So I didn't really know an awful lot of gay people or lesbians at all. And I think it's really important just to see ourselves represented, whether it's in a portrait in an exhibition or on film, or celebrities coming out or football stars or whatever it is. I think if there's nothing to be ashamed of, and I've never felt, I think probably because I came out as an adult, I've never had my queerness affect my sense of self or my identity. I've never felt apologetic at all. I feel very lucky for that. But why not shout about it? It's a really positive aspect of my life, and something I celebrate, and something I really want to celebrate in my work.
I think it's really interesting when you say about, role models and celebrities and well-known people. And of course, there's a much smaller aspect, which is just going about your daily life. If I'm holding my wife's hand, walking down the road. I also have worked for a number of years for a charity called Diversity Role Models that goes into schools and teaches young people, I might look like your grandma, there's nothing to be scared of, and I'm a lesbian. So it's about, I think it's a kind of multi-pronged approach we need, LGBT History Month and throughout the year, for gay and queer people to be visible, and trans people to be visible, from the highest celebrity to just a very ordinary person going into school talking. Absolutely. And I'd like to ask a wee bit about your work as an artist. We might come back and talk about some more queer representation, although we might talk about it in this section, because you mentioned that the documentary was from quite a number of years ago. So my question is, what has changed, or for you or not, as an artist, and who you paint and how you paint? When you look at that, what seems like very old work to you, which to me looks super bright and modern and contemporary, what do you tell us about what life for you is like now compared to what we saw there?
Gosh, yeah, I suppose a lot has happened in some ways. I mean, my life is quite similar in the fact that in the sense that I try and get into the studio every day, and things have got a little bit easier in terms of exhibiting and teaching and all of that. I think I became quite conscious a number of years ago of the fact that I had a responsibility, especially if I was going to start putting on exhibitions purporting to represent the queer community, that I needed to really think critically about that, about who I was painting, and not just paint middle-class white lesbians, really. I had to think about the people I knew and loved and admired and respected, that were doing amazing things, but that maybe didn't look like me, or that weren't from my background. Trans people, Black and brown people, people who are intersex, also, people from different classes. I needed to really think about what I was doing, because the people who I painted, I suppose my portraits happily were getting a bit more attention, which is great. I painted Dr. Ronks in 2019, and that was in the 2019 BP Portrait Award. And Dr. Ronks is a friend of mine and just fabulous A&E doctor, Black, identifies as trans, and is just a brilliant role model. And that painting was used in a lot of their marketing and was all over London on sort of bus shelters and bus stops rather, and phone boxes and things. It was in the tube as well. So, I mean, if I have any, influence at all, I feel a really serious responsibility to kind of share that if I can. And I guess stylistically, my work has changed a lot as well. So it's becoming more expressive and sort of more colourful in a sense. Being from New Zealand, I've always loved colour, although I trained in this country as a portrait painter. And so I realised I was using all of these muted kind of colours. I'd probably say this in the film perhaps, but at some point I thought, I'm not painting for anyone else at all. My painting has to be a reflection of who I am and what I enjoy and how I want to paint. And I don't want to sit there with tiny brushes for days and days. I want to use big, bold, expressive marks. And so I've been really battling with that, really trying to sort of change the way that I paint, so it's more in line with the way that I want the process to go for me.
That's really interesting about talking about those big bold strokes, because there's all that beautiful work as well in the Portrait of a Lady where it's those kind of big strokes, and there must be something very liberating rather than I'm sure there's something very enjoyable and liberating in the small thing too, but there's something nice about those. And your paintings always look so layered, like there's like a lot of paint on there, like there feels like there's a lot of brushstroke and paint in them.
Yeah, I mean, I love oil paint. I love the sort of plasticity of it and the physicality of it. And this is one of the saddest things about this current pandemic, is that you can see my work as a JPEG or on a website, but you can't see it up close in the gallery at the moment, which really makes me so sad. But that's the thing I love about painting is the surface and the sort of the plastic quality, the sort of gesture of it.
Yep. So speaking of lockdown, but actually before I go there, I think a lot of people, me, I think we've got this idea that there's a painter and there's a sitter, and the person is there physically in the room and you look at them a lot, and and also that they must sit I mean, even I've got this idea that they must kind of sit formally and kind of upright. Is that actually true? And B, is that, do you work with a person sitting in a chair, or do you work from a photograph, or tell us a little bit about how you would actually go about creating a portrait of someone, and how that's happening now in lockdown.
Nuala, I just sorry, it's Dominique here from Newham Council. I just wanted to say it's a fascinating discussion, but we've got some great questions coming in on the chat, starting to pop up on the screen. So when you're ready, I think at some point we could move on to that as well. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I'll be quick. But basically, I trained to paint from life. So weeks and weeks and weeks of somebody sitting there for you, a model, in the same position, painstakingly. You put markers on the ground and everything, and the light has to be the same, and all of that. And there is that tradition, absolutely, of painting from life. And many portrait painters who are working today will work that way and work that way only. Famously, Lucian Freud, for example. I mean, there's tons of painters that will only ever paint from life, and will take an awful lot of time over it. And that's part of their whole process. My work is becoming less about really depicting what's in front of me, You can see that in the colourful backgrounds. It's becoming more about sort of absolutely getting a likeness of somebody, but it's becoming more, I guess I'm directing the image more, if you want to use a sort of film analogy. I'm sort of, in a way, kind of trying to make a painting that's compelling and dynamic, as well as sort of depicting an individual, but to have my thoughts sort of come across in the painting. So I work from photographs, and that requires generally 1 or 2 sittings, sort of photo shoot, where I go along, take a load of hundreds and hundreds of photos, because I'm not a particularly good photographer. So I work on the theory that if I take a lot, a couple will be okay. And I might use a hand, for example, from one shot and the expression from another. So it becomes a kind of composite, but I am essentially in my studio alone, generally with the radio painting. That's
Thank you. Good. We're going to have a look at some of the audience questions. So thank you so much for your comments already, and thank you so much for these questions as well. It's lovely to see the comments coming in. So we've got a question here. It's from Sarah. Does a portrait offer its subject more of a screen or a shield?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and a tricky one. I think in a way it partly depends on the relationship between the painter and the sitter. In some ways, you know, you can hire any number of portrait painters to paint you, and they will all have different processes in terms of their work. I always try and get to know the sitter, to spend some time with them, even if they're commissioning me and I have never met them before. I like to visit them at home and spend a bit of time with them if I can. A screen or a shield? You know, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'd like to think that a successful portrait does capture something of, you know, maybe captures the wrong word, but relates something of how a person is in the world. And I think that can only ever really be an impression.
Yeah, fantastic. A question here from Andy. Is there a way forward in collaborative artistic production that moves away from the traditional objectifying processes? So more collaborative artistic production that moves away from that objectifying process?
I mean, I would really hope so. And I think, you know, certainly in film, like the film you've just seen, The Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I think, as you were saying, Nuala, with this kind of circular gaze, that sounds like that was a much more collaborative process in all of the interviews I've seen about the film. In terms of painting, you know, that I guess we're so sort of attached to that idea of the individual as, you know, a painter in a sense, or an artist. But I would hope that there would be a more collaborative way forward. I mean, if I have the opportunity to bring someone in any way, you know, I will, and I like things to be more collaborative. It feels more interesting, frankly, more of a dialogue. And when I've painted writers before, for example, and had exhibitions of that work, I've asked the writer to come and perform a piece in response to the work, so that they're physically there and that they also have a voice. And similarly with performers, I painted Ursula Martinez and in an exhibition called Threesome, which was amazing. We all, the three of us artists, painted her nude, and we had her in the final sort of closing event of the show, we had her perform in front of the portraits. And that was a way of trying to, you know, give her some sort of, not give her agency, that's probably the wrong way to phrase it, but to have a collaboration and to have a dialogue around what we were all doing, to try and disrupt that idea of the gaze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really interesting, and that's how. And for me, I think the art is always better with more ideas. You can pare it back, and it'll still be your work. But there's something so lovely about collaborative work. The third and final question we've got for now is and it's from Mabel. In the documentary, I paraphrase, you mention that often stories tend to centre on sex, but but relationships go beyond sex. Why do you think media does this, and how can we start to change this? That's a big one to finish up with.
It's a big question. I don't know if I'm best placed to answer it, but I do think, you know, I've now been out and queer for, I've lived, you know, as a lesbian for 10 years, maybe a bit more, but there's so much, there's such a rich community and such a sort of, it's been nothing but enriching. That's all I can say. And a lot of that has come from going to film festivals, for example. Nuala, I've seen you a lot at various film festivals and art events. And, you know, I know a lot of other sort of creative people in the community. And it's just, you know, there's so much more, I think, the friendships that you sort of nurture and things. And I think it is so often reduced to a sexual preference. And for some people it is, that's all it is. And that's all they see it as. But personally, I think that there's such a rich sort of artistic, nurturing culture around being queer or LGBTQI plus, however you identify. I think, yeah, there's more, and I'm not sure why the reduction really. I mean, pass.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of being on the margins is that you're on the margins and you see things differently. And I thought you made a very interesting point in the documentary where you said, you know, it can be about sex, but it can also be about texture and touch and sensuality, which isn't the same as sex. And again, that came up very strongly in Portrait of a Lady. You know, there were so many glances and touches and gazes and fabrics and, you know, so it's all of a piece, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the film I mean, it's absolutely suffused with intimacy, that film, and sort of that kind of desire and yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of queerness throughout it, really.
Yeah. These are absolutely fantastic questions. Thank you so much. I'd like to kind of talk about what you're working on just now, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work you were doing with Lola Flash, which is the most recent thing that I'm aware that but you might have been up to other things too. Just tell us a bit about what's on your cards, you know, recently and currently.
Okay, the portrait of Lola Flash, which is a large portrait, really happily got into the BP Portrait Award, which
And just tell us who is Lola Flash?
sure, she's a photographer. She's based in New York. She's a queer Black photographer. She's brilliant. I met her at an exhibition that she was having in London at Autograph Gallery, and I love her work, which is very much about representation and visibility. You should check her out if you don't know her yet. And she's been around for, you know, she's been working in this way for 3 decades, I think. So, you know, she's someone I really look up to and admire. And I felt there was a sort of kinship there in a way, in that she's dealing with portraiture in a totally different medium. But we had a lot to talk about in terms of that. So anyway, she's based in New York, and I took photos when I was there and made this painting of her. And it's been it was supposed to be in London, and then anyway, it ended up at the Aberdeen Art Gallery for a time when it was able to be open, and it's stood up there. So shortly, hopefully, be coming back to London soon. But I am working on a new series of large portraits, hopefully to be exhibited this summer, pending everything to do around the pandemic. Hopefully we'll be exhibiting again then. But there are people, I'm hoping to have a group of maybe 10 portraits, including people such as campaigner Peter Tatchell, and Baroness Ruth Hunt, who used to run Stonewall, Rita Loy, who some of you may know of, who's a writer, musician and activist, various sort of other people in the community, but also outside of our community. So various people who are sort of campaigning for change, and people who I just really have wanted to paint for a long time, I guess, people I admire. So that's coming up soon. I have a few other things around International Women's Day and that sort of thing, a few group shows coming up, but all of that tends to end up on my social media at some stage, and I'm pretty much everywhere: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all of that.
We've just, I see Priscilla's just put all your social media details in the chat there. You also do teaching as well. And how's that working in the pandemic? How are you doing any teaching?
Yeah, I do have a sort of slot with our full-time students at the Heatherley School of Fine Art, which is where I also trained 10 years ago. So I do have a sort of a project coming up with them, and that, I mean, it's all online, unfortunately, so it's difficult in a way to see the texture of a painting and to, you know, look over someone's shoulder to see how they're mixing colours and all of that. But we do the best that we can, and I think the continuity and support is the main thing, really. And I'm also offering sort of one-on-one tutorials, so if there are any budding painters out there, or if you have your own practice and just want someone to chat things through with, I'm also doing that now on a one-to-one basis.
And what is that, like a Zoom kind of situation? Yeah. Fascinating. It's so interesting, actually, how quickly we've all found different ways to work and still be connected. I mean, it does not beat being in Stratford Library on a Friday night. It doesn't beat being in the pub or being in a film festival or being an exhibition, but we're still physically in an exhibition, but we're still somehow we're still managing, because we do need this connection. We do need this art in our lives.
Yeah, I think we all have to do the best we can. And there are some bonuses as well. You know, you can now, you know, it's more normal, I suppose, to sort of interact with people who are in different time zones in a sense. And there are definitely positives, or people who might not have otherwise been able to access various things, various events.
Yeah, we're definitely finding that in the film festival world. You know, filmmakers joining us on Zooms from Guatemala and Tbilisi, and also people who couldn't physically, either financially or maybe physically wouldn't be able to get to a small cinema in Lewis, can still join us online. I think we're probably going to wrap up now, unless any other questions have come in. I don't see any more here. It's been really fascinating talking to you. It's been really lovely to catch up, because I do know you in real life, but I haven't seen you for ages. So it's been really nice hearing more about your work and your thoughts on the documentary and the feature film. So that's about all that we've got time for from this LGBT History Month with Newham Council. Priscilla, our moderator, has put some links in the chat. So there'll be Sarah's on the usual social media. She's on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and the links are there. Hopefully there'll be a link soon for the Newham Council's LGBT History Month. If you want to find out about them, they're at newhamlgbthistory.org. If you want to find out more about tonight's hosts, so that's Newham Community Cinema and the Women Over 50 Film Festival, we're on social media, Insta and Facebook and Twitter, and hopefully the links are coming up there for you soon. For Newham Com Cinema and WO50FF for WOF. What else have we got in store for you? We've got the next 3 Thursdays in February. It'll be an evening, something like this. There'll be a WOF, there'll be some sort of short. Some will be from WOF, some are other ones. Then we'll have a feature film, and then there'll be a host and some special guests in this kind of situation, and you can join in with the questions as well. Coming up next week, we've got 2 brilliant Black, queer, London-based films. We've got the short, Damien, by Natasha Minwanze, and the feature film, Stud Life, by Campbell X. And both of these films tell stories of trans life, butch life, queer life, through friendship, blood, tears, laughter, and grit. Total must-see films. You won't want to miss them. There'll be another host and another great guest in conversation back next Thursday. So make sure that you keep in contact with Newham Council and book your ticket now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Happy LGBTQI History Month. Thank you so much, Sarah Jane. It was so lovely to see you, and thanks for your time and your knowledge and your expertise.
Thank you, Nuala.
And so it's goodbye from Sarah, and it's goodbye from me. Goodbye.
Thanks, Nuala. Thanks so much.